Will O'Callaghan is with us at 8:32. Will, how are you?
I'm trying to work out, lads, whether that's the actual footage from that rugby head coach or whether that's a Richie McCormick impression of him. I'm not quite sure.
Oh no, that's the real one. We have a sting for this. I didn't. Apologies. Here we go.
Some of these critics, these pundits.
I absolutely adore them lads. I have unbelievable time for them, but they're a great bunch. But it's not acceptable.
They like to play the hard man when they're on it. It's not very pleasant when you're trying to manage a team. All you're looking for is a bit of civility and a bit of decency, but they just miss you like you know, you have nothing to do with the bloody occasion.
If Richie's impression is that good, we need to get him doing stuff with it. That's like, our opportunities are endless. Think of the crank calls.
Yeah, no, he can do that particular head coach really, really well. I think it's probably in his top 3 or 4 impressions he can do.
Oh, Mauro, we've decided to make you captain.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry about all those things I wrote about you in my book. It was really bad. I was, I shouldn't really have been writing a cash-in book in the middle of my time here. I should really wait, like everybody else does, to do it at the end, and then I can do my book tour.
Yeah, like Joe Schmidt writing a book during the World Cup, essentially.
Will, good morning to you.
Morning, lad.
I just want to, it's important that we all recognise when we make mistakes and we grow and we change as an organisation and a group, and particularly as an individual, that you have learned that Ireland is actually 32 counties on the island thing, that there's more than just this mythical barrier that you had erected. I do believe that, sometimes people in the Midlands, there's that post-colonial hangover, which is even more than it is for the rest of us, because you guys were infested with the planters. We know that, and there's probably a little bit of planter blood in all of you, so it's fine. I get that you kind of have that umbilical link all the way back to our colonial past, and sometimes you can't throw off those shackles. You're just an agent of the state, whatever the state may be. In this case, it was like the hurling superpowers, but you've grown. There are more than 12 counties in Ireland.
Yeah, we're up to 24 on the new list. It almost sounds like an appropriate metaphor for the development of hurling, where it has been forgotten in so many counties.
You are right.
When, with the exception of a few hamlets in Ulster where hurling is promoted incredibly strongly, like in Antrim, and then they don't even get a slot on League Sunday last week when they played away from home against Kilkenny. And then, the sport has been slow to grow, and I think that is on everybody within Gaelic games that hurling has not been pushed strongly enough, particularly, say, north of Mullingar, with the exception of some of the counties in Ulster. And I would say, with the exception of Galway, in Connacht, it's not been pushed strongly enough traditionally in Connacht either. So we're happy enough to have, say, 8 or 9 teams who are contesting at a really high level. But we have, as you say, corrected the power rankings to include teams from the Lory-Maher and the Christy Ring this week, and we will be updating these as we go through the summer. It's one of those things as well. I think the most abuse that probably came in last week was obviously around Galway, including, one guy tweeted me at 3:30 in the morning on a Saturday, just not even linked to anything with their
so you work
power
for
rankings.
high-profile paper.
Yeah, it was like, clown, how can you put Galway into 9th place? I think I just replied and went, just look at the rankings and you'll see why I explained it. But the other one that we got, obviously, in the YouTube comments were, look, you got to go further than just the top 12. So we have corrected that mistake.
Excellent.
And now we've got 24.
Okay, so we're starting with 24 to 16.
Yeah, so you're looking at the teams who potentially towards the bottom of this are those who are going to be competing hopefully later this year to try and win the Lory-Maher, and you've got some teams towards the bottom of the Christy Ring. So just to run through this pretty quickly, you've got Donegal and Mayo in 24th and 23rd respectively. You've got Roscommon, who went down last year into the Lory-Maher from the Christy Ring. And then you've got Sligo, who got to the quarterfinals of the Christy Ring last year, as well as Wicklow. Above them, the beaten Christy Ring finalists of last year, who are Derry, who are in 19th. And then the placing for 18th and 17th was decided somewhat by their opening round game in Division 2A of the Hurling League last weekend, where Meath got the better of Kildare. Albeit Kildare will have their ace players coming back in after winning the All-Ireland last weekend. But at the moment, I think Meath are just ahead of Kildare, and that's your 17 to 24 on the list.
I mean, I do think that those next players will have an impact. But look, I understand Tommy got you, and that's fair enough. We'll keep going, Will. Don't worry. We'll come back to that.
Right, okay, so we go along to the top 16 then when we look at the next round of teams. So we're going towards the top end of the Christy Ring here. Perhaps the biggest surprise on this one is Carlow being down in 16th currently. This is a Carlow team who 3 years ago were getting loads of pats in the back after they got a draw against Galway, and people were thinking that maybe they might actually go ahead of their neighbours in Laois and become the next best team outside the top sides in Leinster. but they've had a little bit of a fall over the last couple of years. Didn't get to the final of the Joe McDonagh last season and opened up their campaign in Division 2A of the Hurling League, losing out to the team who were just above them in 15th in Down last week. The unsavoury fallout from that game as well, with accusations around sectarian language possibly being used on the pitch as well. But that was a great start for Down in Division 2A. Down coming off the back of winning the Christy Ring 2 seasons ago and now trying to become an established team both in 2A and in the Joe McDonagh. So I've got them ahead of Carlow. Kerry, who started off disappointingly last weekend, losing out away from home against Westmeath, one of their rivals for promotion from Division 2A, come in 14th place. They lost the Joe McDonagh Cup final last year, but obviously had an interesting start to pre-season when they beat Tipperary for the first time. And they'll feel, Stephen Malumphy's side, that they can bounce back from that defeat last weekend. Carlow this weekend have got Westmeath at home, and you would think if Westmeath win that game going into the 1 week break, Westmeath would actually be really well set up to top that division. And we'll see if Kerry can bounce back this weekend. I've put Offaly in, the Christy Ring winners from last year, into 13th place. They beat Kerry last year in league and they finished the league unbeaten, albeit they started the campaign last weekend with a very poor defeat against Galway. With the manner of the defeat, they conceded 4-22 and coughed up a series of other goal chances during the game. It could have been even more of a beating than the double scores defeat that they took. But Offaly are unlikely to win any games in Division 1A of the Hurling League. They've got Cork at home in Birr this coming weekend, which is a difficult start against the Cork team who really opened up against Clare last week. But realistically, you go back over the last 6 seasons since there was a slight streamlining of the league, only 6 wins for the teams who come up from Division 2A the season before across those 6 years. So it trends at 1 a season. And with Offaly's very difficult group there, with a couple of recent All-Ireland champions in Division 1A, they're unlikely to win a game. But I think they go into the Joe McDonagh with a serious chance of getting to the final, despite the fact they were playing in the Christy Ring last year. So as a result, they're in 13th.
All joking aside, by doing what you did with just the 12 teams in the rankings last week, you kind of said the quiet bit out loud, is that there isn't enough investment, that there isn't enough care given to these counties. That stat that you have is actually really damning of the hurling authorities, who constantly tell us about how great their championship is because everybody gets games at their own level. But what's supposed to follow that is an analysis of why they're not able to make the leap and what the level of funding required to make the leap would be. But instead, what we see is like, sure, no one really cares about this. And I think that conversations like this help expose that.
Yeah, look, it feels a little bit like a revolving door, because what tends to happen is, particularly now that the Leinster Senior Hurling Championship is de facto a development division towards the bottom, so the team who wins the Joe McDonagh Cup is going to go into the Leinster Championship for next year. And then what tends to happen is the team who gets relegated from the Leinster round robin series will drop back into the Joe McDonagh, will become the favourites to win that competition, will almost certainly come back up within the year or the following year. They tend to be the teams that are at the bottom of Division 1 and at the top of Division 2. So it becomes very difficult to claw your way up into Division 1 hurling to consistently get to play it. Now, Laois may be the exception. For the last 10 years, they've played in Division 1, but they've had to play in relegation playoffs in many of those years over the last 10 as well. So there's a definite feeling that the big teams get to play against each other. That's preparation time for the championship. And then the only real aspiration you've got, if you're slightly below that, is to draw yourself into a group where maybe you get to play against each other. So whether that be Laois, Antrim, Kerry, Offaly, Carlow over the next few years. And that has been just the case for the last 5 or 6. And this new kind of reformed league over the last few years, where particularly you've got one very strong group with the way it's set up, just sets up the Division 2 champions to be cannon fodder. We saw that with Westmeath last season as well, where they lost all their games and lost some of them quite heavily. Now, for Westmeath, it still meant they were at a better standard going into the Joe McDonagh, but there is a definite feeling that there's a gap that's incredibly hard to try and make up for the team who come up from Division 2.
I wonder what is being done. Like, what is the level of investment in strength and conditioning? What is the level of investment in schools coaching? What is the level of investment in development squads? And who should be footing the bill for that? It should be centrally, really. It's like we've identified these counties. There are enough people on the ground trying to help. We've seen that they can't get beyond this. There's a logjam there. What's that logjam? It has to be investment. And if there's no investment, fair enough, you've just decided that you don't really want those, and it is actually we should just concentrate on the 12 teams.
Yeah, well, look, structurally the counties have to help themselves as well, and there has to be a will within the counties, particularly when we look at them slightly further down the totem pole, to actually try and kick hurling on as well. Like, it's no coincidence that when you go outside the top 16 particularly, you are looking at teams who are predominantly football counties and probably quite successful at football as well. So it's about having that balance, and that's not to say that some of these counties haven't made big efforts. And look, the GA have brought in things like hurling directors, and they've had people from stronger counties go to try and help out with coaching within those who are developing, and there is a reasonable amount of funding which is made available. The problem is that in this arms race, you're looking at the Munster teams and then, say, Kilkenny and Galway particularly, who are just so far ahead from a starting position. It's incredibly difficult to try and get up to that standard.
All right, let's move on. So the controversial here starts at 9 is Galway. So 12 Westmeath, 11 Antrim, 10 Laois, 9 Galway.
Yeah, so Westmeath won last week against Kerry, which is a good start for them. They won the Keogh Cup. I think they're probably still just behind Antrim, who put in a very credible performance against Kilkenny by all reports, because we didn't have TV cameras to show the game against Antrim and Kilkenny. I wonder how that would have felt if Antrim had actually pulled off a shock last weekend and had beaten Kilkenny. But I think Antrim, as a result, have to be just ahead of Westmeath in that one. Laois lost to Tipperary, who we'll talk about when we get into the top 8. But Laois hurled very well, despite the fact that they played a lot in the second half with 14 men. So again, I don't think they've lost anything from defeat in that. And then I've kept Galway in 9th position, despite the fact that they had a double digits victory against Offaly last weekend to kick off things for Henry Shefflin. I will know a lot more about Galway, and Galway could potentially climb if they can beat a Limerick team, maybe sniff a little bit of blood in the water this coming weekend. And if Galway get a victory, I've no doubt they're going into the top 8 at that point. But I don't think...
That's not how this works. They're catapulted up, like they're number 2 or something if they beat Limerick, right? I mean, come on, you can't be like, you need to show me something, Galway. You need to show me, you've just beaten the All-Ireland champions, greatest team of all time. I'm not seeing enough from you, lads. I just need a little bit more.
Well, look, spoilers here, you're not seeing Wexford go up into second place, despite the fact that they beat Limerick last week. But Galway will move up naturally enough if they get a result against Limerick this coming weekend. I think Galway, you can't really put them into the top 8 on the back of beating the weakest team in Division 1 last week. So
okay, fair enough. Okay, so RIP your mentions again. Onto the page 1.
All right, so Clare are on the fall here. They're the team who've gone down a couple of places because a mix of factors, really. They defended so loosely at Páirc Uí Chaoimh against Cork last weekend. It was... while Cork, this is what happens. You can't give Cork's forward line space or allow them a game which is open, because if it goes into Harlem Globetrotters style up and down hurling, Cork will beat most teams in the league and championship this year. So Clare need to tighten that up. And then they've also lost Colin Galvin, one of the best midfielders around in the championship. Unfortunately, he's had to retire. So we've lost 2 really great players over the last week, with Pádraig Maher in Tipperary and Colin Galvin with Clare. So they've slipped down to 8th place, ahead of playing the team who are up to 7th in Wexford this weekend. So it's a really important game in Division 1B this weekend, Division 1A, which is Wexford against Clare. Wexford go up to 7th on the back of beating the All-Ireland champions Limerick. Don't overplay this too much, because we remember Limerick last year didn't win in any of their first 3 games in the league and still went on to clean up when championship came around in the summer. But you have to respect what Wexford did last week, particularly with Rory O'Connor not being available with his hamstring injury, Lee Chin not being there. One of the real question marks about Wexford were whether they could dominate games around the middle of the field if Lee Chin wasn't available. Well, they showed they could last week. They tied up Aaron Gillan. He didn't score from play last weekend for Limerick. And maybe it starts to ask a few questions about Limerick's depth, particularly when they don't have Cian Lynch available. Now, again, he's concentrating on the Fitzgibbon currently, and when he comes back in, he'll add dynamism into their midfield. But they lacked some, let's say, creativity within what they were doing from midfield. There was a lot of lateral passing from Limerick last week at Wexford Park, and Wexford got out by a goal. So as a result, they have to go up to 7th. I've put Dublin up to 6th, not just purely based on the Waterford result, which was a good one for them last week to rook it out against a Waterford team who were going into this power rankings in 2nd place. Very credible draw for Dublin. Also won the Walsh Cup in pre-season. Have looked good so far this year. The only doubt about Dublin is, are they going in a bit strong at the start of the year? Like, this is a team that seems to be coming in full pelt, Matty Kenny's side, for the start of the league. Where are they going to be when the round robin comes around for the Leinster Championship? And I still think the one real question mark you've got about Dublin is they don't have an inside forward that compares with what's available for the teams inside the top 5. Like, what they wouldn't give for Conor Callaghan becoming disinterested in football and going to play hurling for a few years.
Call, isn't it? It's worth the call.
I genuinely think if you're Matty Kenny and you already know Con as well as he does from club level, just try and convince him and say, look, Dublin are in transition in football.
Do you know what you do?
You've already got everything from the football.
You say, look, I'll let you play both. You can play both. You can. We'll cut our training whatever way you want. You can play both for me if you want. And then you go and have that conversation. You see what Desi says.
Well, we know what Desi's going to say to that.
What's he going to say?
No.
Well, then he's a hurler.
Then he's a footballer.
Well, I don't know. Maybe not. You know,
it's 100% worth a call. And like, what would How transformative would that be? Will, like, I mean, Tommy Walsh said he's one of the top 10 hurlers in the country a couple of years ago.
He said he was the best. He was like doing a power ranking at that time of the year. It was off season, no split season at that point, but it was certainly.
Tommy said Con was number one. Yeah,
Cooler were on the run, and he was like, we were like, who's number one? Con O'Callaghan. What?
Look, I remember how impressive Con O'Callaghan was when he was playing under 21 with Dublin, and obviously we've seen what he's done with Coola over the last 4 or 5 years. It's still very much untested though until you see him play senior intercounty hurling. It could be a totally different beast. It's not necessarily a case of somebody who is a massive star at club level is going to step straight in, but obviously Con has got all the conditioning with the football. He's an elite athlete. I would, just as a hurling fan, love to see it for a year or two, because Dublin have got a lot right further back in the field, got a good free taker. It's almost like all the ingredients are there, with the exception of having an inside forward who could really take him to the next level. And Con O'Callaghan could well be that player if they were looking at who's available within the county.
The Leinster Championship is suddenly looking a bit lit.
It looks a bit better than it did coming out of last year, because we had a few very tame games and we had an underperforming Galway team. We had Wexford looking nowhere like what they were in the 2 years previously. But then Wexford have started the league well. We'll judge an awful lot more about what happens in Ennis this coming weekend. Then we've got 2 teams just above them who I was tempted to drop, but have kept them just provisionally in 5th and 4th, because they won scratchy but won last weekend, which is Tipperary in 5th place. This is a new look Tipperary who actually moved the ball around pretty well against Laois, but never really pulled away in the game. They missed the penalty as well, which could have given them a bit of a lead in the first half. Felt like they never really shook off Laois, but still got the win in the end in O'Moore Park. And Kilkenny, who got their victory, which is very workmanlike, against Antrim. So Tip and Kilkenny stay in 5th and 4th place respectively. Obviously a huge blow since we spoke last in the power rankings, with Paddy Maher being forced to retire for Tipperary. He's one of those players I think who would have eased the transition for Colin Bonner's side and would still have been a key player for them this season, but they're going to go in a different direction, and it looks like it's going to be opportunity for some of the players who were sitting on the bench for the Premier over the last couple of years.
All right.
Top 3?
Yeah.
Right, so Waterford dropped down 1 place despite the fact that they drew against Dublin last week. Obviously they're still waiting for some of their players to come back in, like Desi Hutchinson will be back in after Ballygunner's final against Ballyhale this coming weekend. And I think, a bit like we talk about Con O'Callaghan, Desi Hutchinson's just so good at stretching play for Waterford when he goes into that forward line, which is reasonably stacked already. It's not a whole lot between Waterford and Cork, but I respect what Cork did last week against Clare. Very good performance from them. You would expect they'll go 2 from 2 this weekend and probably run up a good scoreline as well. So Cork just edge ahead of Waterford as a result of the 2 games last weekend primarily.
I think the real one is Limerick top, and then I actually have Tip and Galway pretty close in a tier below them. I just need to see it from both Waterford and from Cork. I think that Cork will be traumatised by what happened last year. I don't think they're going to be able to blink that away. And so that's what
Cork are guaranteed to be better than last year, aren't they, in terms of quality? Granted, the way they lost the final might scar them, but they're the one team, when you look at the age of the players, they're going to get better this year, no?
Well, I don't know. I mean, their most important players is the same age as a bunch of players who've recently retired.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah, well, like, I mean, obviously, but like Horgan's still there at least.
He is still there.
He is not in the cohort of players who've retired.
Anyway,
so
diminished, but right.
Look, I think Cork still have to find a few key positions on the team. I think they need to work out who's going to hurl, particularly in their half back line. I think they need to get a settled 6 who's going to be a defensive 6 to play there. Like, that's what we saw in the All-Ireland final against Limerick. Limerick were able to take apart the deficiencies within the Cork defence, and Cork have got all that skill further up the field like we saw last weekend. So look, they're probably not going to stay second for the entire year, but it's where you put them after the results from last weekend. And like, there was no real temptation to drop Limerick despite the defeat against Wexford last week. I'm sure John Kiley will look at the amount of wides that they hit. They'll look at the fact that, you know, Cian Lynch wasn't there in the middle of the field, and he will look at the slow start last year and say they're trying to peak for Munster Championship. With everything Limerick have done over the last 4 seasons or so, they still stay number 1.
One last thing we need to talk about before we go. I know I was slagging off people from the Midlands at the start of this, but that was all in good clean fun. I guess the people in the Midlands must be very proud, and it feels a bit weird to be proud of a company, but what Glenisk have done in becoming the sponsors of Offaly at this particular moment when the factory burned down last year, and it looked like production was going to stop, and there was loads of cows that weren't going to be able to be milked, and it was like a kind of, it required a a local community effort to help this massive global corporation, and it was kind of a reminder to all of us that like everything is interlinked, and that company wouldn't be the massive success it is without the people of the Midlands in particular, and they're now showing support for the GAA in Offaly at a particular moment when Offaly GAA seems to be on the rise, but really needs the injection of money that's going to come from this too. And the jersey looks pretty sweet, Will.
That's not bad. This is literally hot off the presses. So Ger Cleary from Glenisk, who was one of those people getting the company back up on their feet after the terrible fire from last year, has put up the new Offaly jersey. I'm assuming it has probably been delivered to Glenisk before anyone else gets a chance to publicise it. So it's the end of Carl's being the Offaly sponsor since the early 90s. It was the longest running one in GAA history at 31 years for Intercounty. But Glenisk now in the front of a new Offaly jersey, which looks pretty streamlined and clean. If you're a Glen Swilly supporter or a Credit supporter, this is probably the template you're going to get from O'Neill's next season when you get your club jersey. But I actually really like the new Offaly shirts, and as you say, fantastic for Glenisk, who very quickly after that fire were straight out to get their milk products back out onto the shelves. They got their yogurts, the first batch went about a week ago, and they announced at the same time that they were going to be sponsors of the Offaly football and hurling teams all the way along. It hasn't been a great start with Offaly's results, both in football and hurling, but still they're competing in Division 1 and Division 2 for the next season, and they're also the All-Ireland reigning under-20 champion, so it's not a bad time, I think, for Glenisk to come on as sponsors of the Offaly team. They've been big supporters locally. They support their local teams in Clodagh Gales and in Killeen Killorn currently, and they've been big sponsors of Offaly Camogie over the last while, so there's a strong connection between sport and Glenisk as well. Yeah,
a properly innovative company as well, who are doing good work and now putting their money where their mouth is as well, and they make tasty yogurt, so it's a winner chicken dinner for the and
just to give them credit as well, Ger, when the fire happened, they continued to pay their staff. Like, it would have been very easy for them when they were hit so hard at the time to just say, we're going to temporarily lay off people, we'll get back on our feet, but they continued to pay people even when they weren't producing product at the time.
All right, that's this week's Power Rankings.